Welcome to the latest edition of the Daily Knockdown. First things first, we're going to talk about Oleksandr Usyk's split decision win over Anthony Joshua in Saudi Arabia. That was a great fight this past Saturday. Usyk faced adversity in the fight. It was a tougher fight in the rematch as opposed to the first time around against Anthony Joshua, but ultimately Oleksandr Usyk prevailed. He fought the fight that he needed to. He outboxed Anthony Joshua, hit him with jabs, hit him with hooks, and even his defense was good enough to make it all 12 rounds. That's something with a lot of Joshua's opponents. Joshua is able to smell blood in the water and attack. With someone like Usyk, even with a size disadvantage compared to Joshua, it didn't matter how aggressive Joshua was this time around in the rematch. Usyk was out to prove why he was the better boxer than Anthony Joshua. He was aggressive. I would say Usyk was even more aggressive on Saturday than he was last September in the first go-around. That jab was landing very clean. He was making Anthony Joshua second guess a lot of the decisions because he was landing solid combos on Joshua. Joshua couldn't really get his guard up all the way before shots were coming his way. And Joshua is so used to just being able to walk down guys and walk down his opponents and control the entire ring. Guess what? In 24 rounds against Oleksandr Usyk, he really wasn't able to do that. I will say for Usyk's performance on Saturday, it probably wasn't as dominant as the first win over Joshua was because it was a closer fight. It was a very competitive fight. It went down to the wire. But Usyk just showed from a technical standpoint, he might be the very best heavyweight in the world. In fact, I think he is the best technical boxer of all heavyweights. From a defensive standpoint, no other heavyweight can really hang with him. Joshua probably would have hurt most heavyweights in that fight, in that scenario, but with Usyk, he just couldn't do it. Joshua had trouble getting Usyk out of there, even when Joshua had Usyk hurt late in the fight, when they were swapping round for round, I believe it was the 10th and the 11th round or the 9th and the 10th round, when it was back and forth with who was hurt. Joshua had Usyk hurt, to Joshua's credit. But Usyk is a warrior. Usyk was able to prevail. He was able to rally, and it helped him out. That was a massive win for Oleksandr Usyk's career. It is just what he needed. Now he has 2 wins over Anthony Joshua. He no longer has to worry about Anthony Joshua. Many people forget that when he accepted that first fight with Anthony Joshua, he knew that if he had beaten Joshua the first time around, he would be forced to fight Joshua a second time. And he said, look, if I can beat him 1 time, I can beat him 2 times. And that's what he did to Anthony Joshua, not only last September, but August the 20th of 2022. A world-class performance from Oleksandr Usyk. And a little bit later, we'll talk about Anthony Joshua and what's next for him. But I want to delve into what is next for Oleksandr Usyk, because essentially whatever is next for Oleksandr Usyk is what's next for pretty much the title picture in the heavyweight division. Pretty much for Usyk, the next fight for him is Tyson Fury for the undisputed title. There's only one more belt hanging out there, and that is Tyson Fury's WBC heavyweight world title. Usyk wants to claim that title so he can be the undisputed, unquestioned heavyweight champion, and the same can be said for Tyson Fury. Now, Tyson Fury has talked about retirement. He's gone back and forth. I don't believe it. In fact, I don't buy it. I don't buy that Tyson Fury will be sidelined forever from boxing, that he's just going to sit at home. No. I truly believe Tyson Fury was waiting for the winner of Usyk, Anthony Joshua 2 to be decided, and then he would make his return. Put it this way, the WBC's president, Mauricio Sulaiman, gave Tyson Fury a deadline of August 26th to decide his future. So that way, the WBC world title is not being held up. Sulaiman at least will have a decision to make, or he will know Tyson Fury's decision, and that way he can decide what to do with the WBC title. Tyson Fury, I think by August 26th, will decide that he's ready to come back, and he's going to take on Usyk. Even Saturday after the fight, he made several videos essentially declaring that he was the best heavyweight in the world and he was ready for Usyk. So it was just a matter of time for the Usyk-AJ rematch to take place, for Fury to come out of retirement, quote unquote, even though I don't really think he was in retirement. Pretty much for Fury, I think it just came down to the money. He wanted to make sure that if he is coming out of retirement, he will get paid for it, as he should. He's the Gypsy King. Right now, he is the most marketable heavyweight in the world, and one can argue he's the most marketable boxer in the world. He's the biggest name in boxing. He is a worldwide brand. It doesn't matter if he fights in the US, if he fights in Saudi Arabia, the UK, people will come to see him fight. People will pay to watch him fight, even on pay-per-view. Tyson Fury is a massive draw, and so is Oleksandr Usyk now. If you beat Anthony Joshua twice, which is something no one has ever done, you're a megastar now. And that's exactly what Usyk is. Usyk, Fury, perhaps maybe in the spring they're going to fight. That is going to be a world clash between those two guys. And I can't wait to see it. I'm sure everyone out there cannot wait to see that fight because it will show truly who the best heavyweight in the world is. Is it the former cruiserweight world champion Oleksandr Usyk, who moved up and took over another division? Or is it Tyson Fury, who's been at the top of the division nearly for the past 10 years? And he's out to prove that he still has it, that he is still the top guy in the heavyweight division. Right now, I don't know who would win that fight. Fury, I would say, has the advantage not only because of his size, but also because of his speed for being 6'9" and 285 pounds, and also his experience as a heavyweight. He's been a heavyweight his entire career. Usyk has only been a heavyweight for less than 3 years. That is a big difference when they fight, whether it's in 2023 or if ever. But if or when that fight happens, that will be a very technical fight. Fury, I think, will try to hurt Usyk, and he probably will, because AJ even hurt Usyk in both fights. So if AJ is able to hurt Usyk, I think Fury can as well. But Usyk has a chin on him. Usyk has great defense as well. He can survive any storm that comes his way. And that's a fight that boxing needs at this point in time. Speaking of what boxing needs, what's next for Anthony Joshua? He's coming off 2 losses now to Oleksandr Usyk. But I don't think his career necessarily is in a bad place. Was it a setback? Sure. No one wants to lose 2 consecutive fights. But for Anthony Joshua, he is still a worldwide phenomenon. He is still a big draw no matter where he fights, particularly in the United Kingdom. I suspect his next fight to be in the UK. I think it's going to be a get back on track type of fight with, a solid veteran heavyweight, but someone who he can beat. In a way, that's pretty much what he had in Kubrat Pulev in December 2020. That was a very winnable fight for him. And it was a get back on track fight after his win over Andy Ruiz in December 2019. It was during the pandemic, in the heart of the pandemic. It allowed him to stake his claim once again in the heavyweight division. And then obviously he lost 2 times to Usyk thereafter. But Anthony Joshua is not done. Anthony Joshua still has a lot left in the tank. And there are 2 fighters who I would like to see him fight again or against. The first one being Luis Ortiz. That fight with Luis Ortiz could only really happen if Luis Ortiz handles his business on September 3rd against Andy Ruiz Jr. If Ortiz gets past Ruiz, I think that would be a possibility for Anthony Joshua and Luis Ortiz to fight. Who wouldn't want to see that? Even if a belt isn't on the line. I mean, people are going to tune in to see Ortiz fight Andy Ruiz. So you better bet that people are going to tune in to see Ortiz and Anthony Joshua. That would be a fight filled with fireworks. Someone I think in that fight is getting put to sleep. And it would be a great fight for Anthony Joshua to prove that he's still around. So that is one fighter who could potentially be Anthony Joshua's next opponent, Luis Ortiz. What about that second possible opponent? I think Deontay Wilder is still out there. Deontay Wilder is set to fight Robert Helenius on October 15th. That's only less than 2 months after AJ's last fight, which took place on Saturday. That is a possible fight, perhaps in 2023 as well. Who wouldn't want to see that fight? These two guys were supposed to fight each other in 2016. They've been calling each other out since 2016. Now it's time to make the fight if Wilder is able to beat Robert Helenius, which I believe he will on October 15th. So if Wilder gets past Robert Helenius, that is also another makeable fight that you can schedule it, line it up. People would still pay to see that. That would do very well on pay-per-view in the US, in the United Kingdom, and all around the world. Wilder and Joshua, that is an epic heavyweight pay-per-view clash. And I still think that fight needs to happen because it was one of those fights that we were robbed of as a boxing community. It was supposed to happen in 2019. The stars were starting to align when Wilder beat Dominic Breazeale in May 2019, and then AJ just had to take care of business in June 2019 against Andy Ruiz, but unfortunately, the bottom fell out, and AJ was stopped by Andy Ruiz. And then he had to pretty much go on a completely different course. He had to seek vengeance for that win over Ruiz. And we just never got the fight between Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. Now is the time. Within the next year, that fight needs to happen. You know, we saw Wilder Fury twice, or actually 3 times. Yeah, we saw it 3 different times. It's only right that we at least get to see Anthony Joshua with another heavyweight great. Yes, we saw him fight against Usyk, who claimed his stake in that division and proved why he's a pound-for-pound great fighter. But Usyk wasn't really in the cards about 5 years ago in the heavyweight division. The big 3 was Joshua, Wilder, and Fury. And Joshua has not been able to fight either Fury or Wilder. A fight against Wilder at this point, I think, will be a lot easier to make because Wilder lost to Fury last October. He's looking for a bit of a, I wouldn't say a tune-up fight because that's very disrespectful to say to Robert Helenius, who's a very dangerous heavyweight, but that's a fight meant for Deontay Wilder to win. If he beats Helenius, he doesn't really have anyone else after that who's really calling for him because Wilder no longer has a title. AJ no longer has a title, or any titles for that matter. So they can easily set that up if both sides are willing to do business, which I hope they will be, because that's a fight that many people want to see. Wilder, AJ, and the first fight that I mentioned, Anthony Joshua, Luis Ortiz, that wouldn't be a bad consolation prize either if Ortiz is able to beat Andy Ruiz, which is another story for another day, which we'll talk about in a few weeks heading up to that fight. But Anthony Joshua, his career is not over. Many people criticized the way he handled the post-fight interview in the ring. I thought he put over Oleksandr Usyk. I thought it was very commendable what Anthony Joshua did. Yes, he talked about himself, but if you watch AJ's fights and his post-fight interviews, he always grabs the mic and captivates the crowd and has that one-on-one moment with the audience and the people watching at home. That's what he does every single fight. And when he loses, he pays respect to the opponent who beat him. And he did the same thing with Usyk. He gave Usyk his moment, but AJ is a star. He has to sell the fight even after so that you're willing to tune in the next time around. So he has to make sure that he's pulling you in, that he's reeling you in, and making sure that you know that he is still the star, that he is still the A side. That's what he does. You can criticize him all you want for how he handled that post-fight interview, but I thought he put over Usyk. I thought it was very respectful what he did, where he had 5 chants from the crowd for Usyk for every single belt that Usyk currently holds. That was great for him. Joshua just proved that he's a class act. That's all he did. And, you know, moving forward in his career, I'm excited to see what's next for Anthony Joshua. I'm also excited to see what's next for Sergey Lipinets, who beat Omar Figueroa, stopped him in the 7th round on Saturday. And I feel bad for Omar Figueroa, and I'll touch on what's possibly next for Omar Figueroa. But Lipinets, he looked sharp in that fight on Saturday night. You could have made an argument that the fight could have been stopped after round 2 when he dropped Omar Figueroa. And credit to Omar Figueroa for battling it out for 5 more rounds and surviving. But Lipinets was the sharper fighter. He had more power than Omar Figueroa. And the sounds that his shots made when they landed on Figueroa were thudding. They were thudding shots that I'm sure you could hear throughout the arena because you could hear them on television on Showtime. Sergey Lipinets is scary at the 140-pound division, and I'm excited to see what world titleist will want to fight him because that was a title eliminator. And Sergey Lipinets took that fight on 5 days' notice. Let's not bury the lead here. Sergey Lipinets was not supposed to fight Omar Figueroa. He wasn't. Adrian Broner was. Broner pulled out of the fight, which is a totally different story, you know. And that is hoping that Adrian Broner is okay and one day will be able to come back to the ring. But this is Lipinets' moment right now. On 5 days' notice, he took this fight, switched course from a different opponent, and fought a former world champion in Omar Figueroa and beat him in convincing fashion. What a win for Sergey Lipinets. Many people kind of did away with Lipinets after, you know, a few losses, and especially his loss to Jaron Boots Ennis most recently. But Lipinets proved that he is still a real contender and a force to be reckoned with, anywhere from 140 pounds to 147. And this guy can cause a lot of problems for many champions and many high-rising contenders and prospects. He's not a gatekeeper. Sergey Lipinets is a legitimate title challenger. He is so good, and he proved it Saturday night. Now, what's next for Omar Figueroa? Omar Figueroa more or less hinted at the fact that his boxing career is at its end. He just isn't the fighter that he once was. And he didn't give himself enough grace when being interviewed by Jim Gray, because Jim Gray asked him, you know, how did you feel about your performance when you only had 5 days to train and prepare for Lipinets? Meanwhile, you were trying to prepare for Adrian Broner for the past 2 months. Figueroa essentially said that, you know, it didn't matter. He's not going to make an excuse for himself. But I do think that played a big role. I thought he was going to beat Adrian Broner, and he probably would have been fast-tracked to a world title, depending on who was available to fight. But Figueroa in my eyes, was going to beat Adrian Broner. And then all of a sudden, on less than a week's notice, before the fight was going to start, he had a new opponent. And he had to adjust to a guy who, right now in 2022, is a better fighter than Adrian Broner is. Of course, a fight against Lipinets is harder than a fight against Adrian Broner. So you go from being the favorite to now being the underdog. That is tough. And I don't know if that is the way he wants to end his career, but Figueroa probably should call it a quit sooner than later because he's on a 3-fight losing streak. His last win came in early 2019 against John Molina, who was well over the hill at that point when they fought. And you could give him some credit for how he looked against Yordenis Ugas in July 2019 because Ugas just proved that he was one of the best welterweights in the world. So you can't discredit Omar Figueroa for losing to a guy like Ugas. But, then losing in May 2021, getting stopped in that fight on the Andy Ruiz, Chris Arreola undercard, that wasn't a great loss. And then last night to Lipinets, that was a tough one. So you're on a 3-fight skid now. You're no longer going to be a main event draw. You're no longer the fighter you once were when you were a world champion, when you were winning interim titles. You're no longer that fighter. So I think Omar Figueroa made the right call by saying, yeah, I'm probably at the end of my career. My body just is breaking down on me. It's not what it once was. And it's probably time for me to call it a career. I'm glad he didn't announce his retirement after the fight. Because after a loss like that, you have to mourn it. Especially if it is the end of your career. You have to sit down with your team, with your family, and figure out what's next. So I think over the next few weeks, this will be important for Omar Figueroa, or even the next few days, to decide what's next for him. Is he going to try to fight again, where he could possibly lose and finish his career, his great career, by the way, on a 4-fight losing streak? Or he can retire main eventing in Hollywood, Florida, against a former world champion in Sergey Lipinets. He can go out in a way where he still has some control, and he's not going to take a ton more damage from this point on, because let me tell you, that loss to Sergey Lipinets, he was taking a lot of damage. He was in the fight. He was even pressing Lipinets up against the ropes, and his output was still there. But when you're getting banged around like that for 7 rounds, the longevity of your career will be cut short. That's just the way it is. And I hope for Omar's sake that he does call it a career, because I don't want to see him get hurt like that. He's no longer the fighter that he was when he knocked out Abner Cotto, or he was in a firefight with Nahito Arakawa. In the past, he had the skills and the determination to win firefights and win fights where he's bleeding and, he may get hurt a little bit, but he's able to come back and win it. Now, I just don't think he's that fighter. And he talked about how this was the first time in his boxing career where he really enjoyed being in training camp. But he was preparing for Adrian Broner all along. He wasn't preparing for Sergey Lipinets, who's a different beast. And he just couldn't pull out a win, even in a firefight. In 2013, yeah, he could win in a firefight. But now, he's not fighting Robert Guerrero. He's not fighting Ricky Burns. You're in a world title eliminator now. You're fighting the best of the best. You were going to fight Adrian Broner, who still is a solid fighter, and then you had to fight Sergey Lipinets. It's not going to get any easier for you. So I think he will make the right decision and leave the gloves in the ring and call it a career, because I just don't want to see him get hurt anymore. And another fight that I want to talk about on that card was Brandun Lee. Brandun Lee was the minus 3,000 favorite. He was dropped in the third round. But that is exactly what you want from a 21-year-old prospect, an up-and-coming prospect. You want him to face adversity, because what will he learn from knocking guys out within 3 rounds every single fight? Not much. He's not going to get better from a conditioning standpoint. He will not get better from an experience standpoint if he's just steamrolling guys. He needs to build up rounds, and that's what he did. It's not great for him to get knocked down, but he showed his resilience. So he was able to get the cobwebs off. So many times in a young fighter's career, they get dropped and they're like a deer in headlights. They don't know what hit them. They don't know how to respond. The same thing happened with Anthony Joshua. He's been hurt before, but when he was dropped by Andy Ruiz in June 2019, he didn't really know how to survive and how to respond. Brandun Lee showed that, okay, I was dropped, but I can get back up and I can pretty much blank out my opponent for the rest of the fight. I can win the rest of the round, and I can show that, yeah, that 10-8 round didn't matter to me. It didn't really mean anything. And that's exactly what Brandun Lee needed at this point in his career. He needed that little bump in the road, that little speed bump, to show that he can get through it and he can keep driving along the highway. Expect Brandun Lee in his next fight, his next go-around, to have a much cleaner performance and probably stop his opponent, because he showed that he can go 10 rounds. Now he needs to get back on track and stop people again. Or if he wants, he can go 10 rounds again and keep working on his conditioning. It's really up to him, because I think Brandun Lee can be a future world champion. I do. That guy is good. He is a name to remember. If you do not know who he is, you need to start paying attention to Brandun Lee, because he is the real deal. And before we wrap up this week's edition of the Daily Knockdown, I want to give a quick shout out to Emanuel Navarrete with a big win over Eduardo Baez, a body shot stoppage. That was a competitive fight for Navarrete. That's something that we really haven't seen from Emanuel Navarrete. Usually he just walks down guys and just has his way. But Baez was a tough opponent for him. But Navarrete showed that his body work is immaculate. And his power is thunderous. He landed it on Baez, and it was just too much for Baez to get up from. So Emanuel Navarrete, I would like to see him fight either Oscar Valdez next or Shakur Stevenson. Navarrete's name was thrown around there for being a potential opponent for Shakur Stevenson in 2022, but now that won't happen because Navarrete obviously accepted the fight against Baez, so Stevenson was forced to take a fight against Robson Conceição in September. But who's to say in 2023 that Stevenson and Navarrete can't get in the ring? Navarrete will most likely have to move up to 130 if he wants to fight either Valdez or Stevenson, but he can do it. Emanuel Navarrete is a great fighter, and whoever he fights next, I think that will be a very great world title fight, whoever it is. Even if it's against Mick Conlan, if Mick Conlan decides to fight Emanuel Navarrete, that's a fight that I would be interested in seeing. That is going to wrap up this week's edition of the Daily Knockdown. I am Michael Daly saying so long, take care, make sure you like this video and you subscribe to the Daily Knockdown on YouTube.